Welcome gamers, it's GM Lee with a video series on learning Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, or SWADE as it's known to most folks. And in this video, we'll be looking at some basic rules and game mechanics. Now I can't cover everything off in one video, so I'll be creating new ones that also explore everything from character creation to combat to understanding all the various options and genres available to game masters and players in starting a new campaign. Videos will be as to the point as possible, following the same concept design as SWADE: simple, fast, and fun. Hopefully you're going to like what you see, so please subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and hit the bell up in the top right corner so you never miss an episode. One of the basic concepts of the game is that player characters, as well as any special villains, monsters, or exceptional NPCs controlled by the GM, are collectively known as wildcards. The idea of a wildcard is that they have a better chance of accomplishing tasks, getting things done, and being tougher in combat. Blake and Sarah, pictured here, are player characters from my 1930s pulp campaign. So, they're wildcards. Everyone else in the game are called extras, including all other normal NPCs, like the ominously named Thug number 1 here. Other than the players, it'll be up to the GM to decide who's a wildcard and who's an extra. But what's the difference? Wildcards have two special abilities. The first is that they can take 3 wounds before becoming incapacitated, whereas extras take only 1. Now, we'll talk about wounds in our video on combat rules. For now, let's look at the second special ability wildcards have, and that's the Wild Die, an extra d6 that's rolled to determine success on all trait rolls. Characters' personal characteristics, such as strength or agility, are known as attributes. Attributes, along with the skills that each character has, are collectively known as traits. Traits start with a d4 and go upwards to a d6, a d8, a d10, and a d12. The die type used to make trait rolls is based on how high a player has purchased their ability or skill levels. For instance, Blake here is a soldier of fortune. His attributes, such as strength and agility, are higher at a d8 each, while skills, such as his shooting and fighting rolls, are both d8, and his survival skill is a d6. Because Blake and Sarah are player characters, every time they make a trait roll, they will also roll a wild die, which is the d6, and take the highest of the two as their roll. But the dice are never combined. So what determines if a roll is a success? For every trait roll in the game, the target number is always a 4. 4 or higher means success, while lower than 4 is a failed roll. The target number is always 4, but modifiers could be applied by the game master based on a task's ease or difficulty. The roll is adjusted by these modifiers and then compared to the target number of 4. Now, our group uses the Foundry Virtual Tabletop for our games. In this scenario, Blake and Sarah come upon a wounded individual in a back alley. While Sarah's character, a doctor, attends to the NPC, Blake decides to look around the crime scene. He asks to make a notice roll to see if he can identify any clues. Blake's notice roll is a d6, plus we roll the d6 for the wild die. He makes the roll, and success. Blake notices the footprints leading away from the body through the oil stain towards the door across the alley. Next, Blake asks to make a survival roll, which in Savage Worlds is used for tracking. His survival roll is a d6, and he wants to determine if the tracks reveal any distinguishing characteristics about the gait of the walk, or possibly the height or weight of the individual. Now, the GM decides this is going to be a moderately difficult task to do on pavement, and with only a few steps to go on. So a -2 is applied to both the survival and the wild die roll. Blake, unfortunately, fails the roll. Meanwhile, Sarah works to stabilize the wounded and unconscious person to keep them from dying. Sarah has a healing skill at a D8, and she keeps a doctor's bag with her with medicines. That gives her a +2 to her roll. Success! Back at the door, Blake tries to see if he can hear anything. The door is very thick and there's lots of daytime noise coming from off the street. So the GM assigns a difficulty penalty of -4. Blake makes his roll, and luckily, one of the dice aces. In Savage Worlds, if you roll the highest number possible on a dice, it aces or explodes. So you roll that type of dice again and then add them together. Dice can keep exploding as long as you keep rolling the maximum. If both your trait die and the wild die are at their maximum value, then you roll again for each of those dice and use the highest of the two totals. With the wounded man now stable, Sarah comes over to see if she can help. They decide to see what's behind the door, but it's locked. Neither of the characters have the thievery skill used for picking locks, but Sarah pulls a hairpin out from her purse and decides to give it a try. Now, if a character doesn't have the actual skill being attempted, that's okay. A D4 is rolled for an unskilled attempt, along with the wild die, and a -2 penalty is applied to both. Unfortunately, in this case, Sarah rolls a 1 on both the trait die and the wild die, and that's a critical failure. The attempt automatically fails no matter what skill or attribute is involved, and something bad happens. For Sarah and Blake, this means that not only did picking the lock fail, but the hairpin broke off in the lock, preventing any further attempts. Blake decides to use his strength attribute to force the door open. It's a pretty sturdy set of oak doors, but Blake decides to check around the hinges to see if there are any weak spots. The GM thinks this is a pretty clever idea, and says there is a place to wedge their fingers in, but applies a -2 penalty. Blake rolls, and the dice explode multiple times, bringing the total to 12. It not only succeeds, but it gains 2 raises. For every 4 points over the target number, after modifiers are applied, the player gets what's called a raise. 4 to 7 is a success, 8 to 11 is a raise, and 12 or higher is 2 raises, and so on. With a raise, something positive can happen, such as bonus damage or any beneficial action that the GM decides would be appropriate. In this case, with 2 raises, the GM decides that Blake has not only succeeded in tearing the door away from its hinges, it's so violent and loud that it shocks into inaction anyone on the other side of the door, thus granting surprise for the players to take advantage of. Everything went pretty well for Sarah and Blake. But what if it didn't? That's where bennies come in. Each player starts the game with 3 bennies. Bennies can be used in many different ways, as shown here. Most of them we'll talk about in another video when we review the combat rules, but for now I'll focus on using a benny to reroll a trait test. Back when Blake failed that tracking roll, he could have spent a benny to reroll. Not only do you spend them, but you can also earn bennies too. The GM can award you bennies for playing your character, such as role-playing hindrances, telling a great story as their character, making bold or decisive actions in the face of danger, or being clever about a situation. It's also nice to get a benny for doing something that brings the table together, like getting everyone to laugh at a well-timed joke. Characters can keep spending bennies on re-rolling as long as they have them. If multiple rolls are involved, you end up taking the highest roll, even if that was the original roll. The one time you can't spend a benny is on re-rolling a critical failure. Any kind of physical token can be used to represent bennies, such as poker chips or specialty markers made expressly for that purpose. I made these out of a wooden rolling pin that I cut, stained, and put labels on. That should cover the basic rules and game mechanics of Savage Worlds. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. I know what I find helpful are the various tools and assets I use in my game. I've listed the artists, designers, and companies below, and with each video, I'd like to highlight one of them. Today, we're going to shine the creator spotlight on Steve McMillan, aka Kidney Boy, on Patreon, whose alley map I used today. Steve's been playing RPGs as long as I have, since 1979, and he creates 1 or 2 urban encounter map packs every month. Each pack contains both grid and gridless versions, and when appropriate, day and night styles as well. But what I love most is the range, with versions made for modern games, post-apocalyptic situations, and my favorite, his vintage maps that I use for 1920s and 30s campaigns, like my pulp campaign, the Odyssey League. Check Steve out on his Patreon. His link is listed below in the comments. I really hope you found this introduction to the basic game mechanics of Savage Worlds to be helpful. If so, please press the like button below the video. In our next video, I'll look at character creation, and to make sure you don't miss it, please subscribe and hit the bell in the top right corner. Thanks very much for watching.